He was 22 years old, a Marine squad leader in western Iraq, the kind of man whose name everyone trusted on the radio. On April 14, 2004, a grenade landed in the desert sand between him and his men. He could have run. He could have taken cover. Instead, he took off his helmet, pressed it down over the grenade, and threw his body on top of it. The explosion killed him, but it saved his brothers. This is the story of Corporal Jason Dunham, the Marine, who gave his life to protect his men, and whose sacrifice became legend. Before we start the story of a hero, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. The Leader Who Stayed Ahead. Jason Lee Dunham grew up in Scio, New York, a small town where the streets ended in cornfields, and everyone knew each other's name. He was the oldest of 3 kids, a natural protector. If a fight broke out at school, Jason was the one who stepped in to calm it down. If someone was being bullied, he was the one who spoke up. He loved sports, loud laughter, and engines, the kind of guy who could take apart a dirt bike and rebuild it by sunset. But behind the jokes was discipline and a deep sense of responsibility. After high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. Friends said it just fit him: structure, purpose, brotherhood. He thrived under the pressure, rising quickly to corporal, leading a squad of Marines by the age of 22. When he deployed to Iraq in 2004, he didn't see himself as a hero, just a leader doing his job. His squad respected him because he didn't bark orders from the back. He was always up front. If there was a dangerous mission, he volunteered first. If there was risk, he took it himself. His Marines later said, he was the kind of guy you'd follow anywhere. You just knew he'd get you home. By spring, Jason's unit had been operating near the Syrian border, in a region boiling with insurgent activity, ambushes, checkpoints, chaos. It was dirty, exhausting work, and it was exactly where he wanted to be. He often told his men, "Stay alert, stay together, nobody gets left behind." Those words weren't just orders, they were a promise. And on April 14th, when that promise was tested in the heat of battle, he kept it with his life. Chapter 2. The Ambush, April 14, 2004. The desert sun was already burning over Karabila, Iraq, a dusty border town near Syria, where the sound of gunfire was as common as wind. Corporal Jason Dunham led his squad of Marines on patrol, a quiet, tense mission meant to intercept insurgents moving through the area. They had been on the road for hours, scanning rooftops, alleys, and broken vehicles. Every shadow could hide a rifle, every corner an ambush. Then, in the distance, the thunder of machine gun fire. A convoy had been attacked nearby. Without hesitation, Jason ordered his men to move toward the sound. They reached a disabled Humvee, smoke pouring from its engine, the smell of burning oil filling the air. As they spread out to secure the area, an insurgent suddenly burst from a nearby vehicle and attacked. Jason tackled the man to the ground. The two struggled violently in the dirt, sand flying, rifles clattering away. Then Jason saw it, a grenade in the attacker's hand. He shouted, "Grenade!" In that split second, he made a decision that would define his name forever. He pushed the insurgent away, ripped off his own Kevlar helmet, and pressed it down over the grenade to contain the blast. Then he threw himself on top of it, his body covering the weapon completely. The explosion ripped through the air. The shock wave knocked his men backward. When they looked up, Jason was on the ground motionless, bleeding, his helmet torn apart, but still holding the fragments of the grenade beneath him. Lance Corporal William Hampton, one of his Marines, screamed his name and ran forward. They tried to treat his wounds, but the damage was catastrophic. Still, Jason was alive. Barely. He had absorbed the blast with his own body. The men he saved were covered in dust and shrapnel, but alive because of him. When the medevac helicopter arrived, they carried him out in silence. No one said a word. Every Marine there knew what they had just witnessed, the purest act of brotherhood the battlefield had ever seen. Chapter 3. The Fight for Life. When the medevac helicopter lifted off from Carabela, Corporal Jason Dunham was still breathing barely. His Marines had done everything they could to stop the bleeding. They spoke to him the whole time, refusing to let him slip away. "Hang on, Dunham, we've got you." He couldn't answer, but somewhere in the haze between pain and silence, he must have heard them. He was flown first to Al-Assad Air Base, then to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, and finally to Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. His parents, Dan and Deb Dunham, were called immediately. They boarded a flight across the ocean, praying that their son would still be alive when they arrived. When they reached his bedside, Jason was unconscious, covered in tubes and bandages. The doctors said the blast had caused irreversible brain damage. He would never wake up. But his mother held his hand anyway. She whispered stories about home, about summers in Scio, about his dirt bike, about the Marines who loved him like a brother. And for a moment she thought she saw his fingers move. His father stood beside her, strong but breaking inside. He looked at the uniform hanging by the hospital door, stained with dust and blood, and whispered, "You kept your promise, son. You brought them home." For 8 days, Jason fought. Machines kept his heart beating, but everyone knew the truth: the battle had already been won, just not the way anyone hoped. On April 22, 2004, Corporal Jason Lee Dunham died of his injuries. He was 22 years old. When the Marines from his squad heard the news, they didn't cry right away. They sat in silence, each man staring into nothing, remembering the sound of his voice shouting, "Grenade." And the split second that changed everything. They had lost their leader, but they had gained a lifetime of debt they could never repay. One of them later said, "He saved us. Every single day since then, I've tried to live a life that is worthy of what he gave." Chapter 4. The Medal of Honor. 3 years after that April morning in Carabela, the United States paused to remember a 22-year-old Marine who had done the unthinkable. On January 11, 2007, inside the East Room of the White House, President George W. Bush stood before a crowd of Marines, Gold Star families, and generals. Beside him were Dan and Deb Dunham, Jason's parents, holding each other's hands so tightly it hurt. The president began to speak. Corporal Dunham gave his own life so that others might live. In his final moments, he showed the world the true meaning of heroism. Then, slowly, he placed the Medal of Honor America as highest military decoration into Deb Dunham's trembling hands. There wasn't a sound in the room except quiet sobbing. A few Marines stood at rigid attention, their eyes wet, their jaws clenched. They had seen the explosion. They had seen what he did. Now they were seeing the world finally understand it. After the ceremony, Jason's parents spoke briefly. His mother said softly, "He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to protect his boys." His father added, "He loved being a Marine. He loved his men. And he did what he had to do." Later that year, the USS Jason Dunham, DDG-109, a 9,000-ton guided missile destroyer, was commissioned in his honor. On its hull, just below the name, the ship's motto was engraved, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. The men who had served under him attended the dedication. They stood in uniform side by side, watching the massive ship glide into the water. One of them whispered, "He is still protecting us, just on a bigger battlefield." Back home in Scio, New York, the high school renamed its athletic field Dunham Field, and every Veterans Day, the whole town gathers there. The loudspeakers fall silent at 2 p.m., and for 1 full minute, no one says a word. Because some names Don T. need speeches, they only need to be remembered. Epilogue never came home. He was 22. A small-town kid who became the kind of man others would follow through fire. Corporal Jason Dunham never came home from Iraq, but the men he saved did. They built families, raised children, lived lives he would never see. And every one of them carries his name like a promise. He didn't die for medals or headlines. He died for something far simpler and far greater. For friendship, for duty, for love. His story reminds us that heroism isn't born in power or fearlessness. It is born in the single heartbeat when you choose someone else's life over your own. Today, his name sails across the oceans on the USS Jason Dunham and echoes in classrooms, in barracks, in every Marine who learns what Semper Fidelis truly means. He never came home. But his courage did living on in every soldier who believes that brotherhood is worth everything. Stay healthy, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.